Selective Service System. Dr. Taylor's research focuses on 19th and 20th century America, the American South, Florida history, U.S. military history, and the history of the space age. He has written or edited numerous books and articles, including This War So Horrible, The Civil War Diary of Hiram Smith Williams, Florida in the Civil War, and a forthcoming book, Florida, A Military History. Dr. Taylor has been the recipient of the Carey Clark Award for Excellence in Teaching and the Florida Tech Alumni Association Award. He received his PhD from Florida State University in 1991. Please welcome Dr. Taylor.
Well, thank you very much and good morning. I'm glad to see so many people out here on a Saturday. It's great. First of all, I'd like to say how honored and humbled I am to be part of this amazing group of scholars. And I'd like to say that I got interested in Florida history many, many years ago because I stumbled into a class taught by Professor Mormino here, who told me that Florida was incredibly important and significant and I should pay attention to it. So I'd like to say that if anyone has a problem with my presentation this morning, all complaints and full blame should go to him. Well, anyhow, a paper that I did for him, and by the way, is it too late for extra credit? Okay. Was on a Florida and the Civil War topic. And whenever I talk about my research and this part of the history of Florida, I almost feel like I have to apologize. Why are we making such a big deal about 4 years out of 500? Was Florida even in the Civil War? I've heard that many, many times. My answer is yes, it was. And some people say, well, whose side was Florida on? Did we win? Well, depends who you ask. Well, Florida indeed was involved in the Civil War, the war between the states, the War of Northern Aggression, or any of the other 20-odd titles for this conflict. I have long argued that it is a microcosm of that experience. Well, why has not more attention been paid to this over the years by scholars? I mean, you could, if you had to buy every Civil War book in print now, you need a second and a third mortgage. Well, I can't take credit for this, but a scholar of Florida Civil War history once said that Florida was the Rodney Dangerfield of the Confederacy. And what did Rodney Dangerfield never, ever get? Help me out, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you. We never got respect. Well, why didn't we get respect? My golly, we were the third state to join the Confederacy. Florida opted for the Confederate States of America before Georgia and Alabama did. And if you look at a map, that's a very brave thing to do. We would have been very lonely out there. Florida would send the highest percentage of its male population to the Confederate Army of any of the Confederate states. Go to Virginia and say that, and they give you funny looks. But it's true. We were involved in this conflict. And as Professor Schaefer pointed out, trying to explain why we opted for this is kind of complicated, as most things are. It's going to have a big impact on the evolution of this state, this entity called Florida. Now, I'm not going to attempt to do the entire history of the state of Florida during the Civil War in the 30 minutes that I have, but I'd just like to point out some of the 20 minutes that I have, excuse me. See, it's running clock's running.
No respect.
No respect. Thank you. Things that are of particular interest. Now, Florida had a very, very able governor during the Civil War, a man named John Milton from Jackson County. A very different sort of Confederate state governor in that he thought that Confederate states should cooperate with that government far off there in Richmond, even though the Richmond government never did anything for Florida. In fact, in the spring of 1862, wrote Florida off strategically. Took our troops, took our supplies, and said, you're on your own in terms of defense. Milton is, I think, a tragic figure because he would work so long and so hard to try to solve these problems, defend his state with very limited resources. Once a Confederate official chastised him for requesting arms from the Richmond government by saying he didn't fill out the proper forms. And Governor Milton's response, at least the one that was written down, was that you might as well have had me apply to the Emperor of China for these weapons. Well, by 1865, of course, the Confederate cause failed, and Governor Milton was not able to deal with it. So, and most scholars think that he took his own life out of depression. Well, anyhow, when the conflict broke out in the spring of 1861, it could very well have started in Florida, at a place called Fort Pickens, outside Pensacola. There's a very good chance of that happening. Of course, it did not, and the folks in South Carolina get the honor or the infamy of saying that they have the place where the Civil War actually started. Now, folks in Florida, as in most of the Confederate South, thought the war is going to be short, easy, and glorious, and the boys will be home by Christmas. In all the wars that have ever been fought, the boys never make it home by Christmas. They're always late. Florida troops would fight in Virginia, they'd fight in Tennessee, and Georgia, and acquit themselves honorably. And I always thought that Floridians in the Confederate Army must have suffered, because in Virginia and Tennessee, it snows, and it's cold. Floridians aren't adapted to handle that climate very well. At home, the home front would be a hugely disrupted place. Remember, Florida was still a frontier society. It had only been a state for a little, 20 odd years, more give or take. Barely 140,000 people in the state. And I can assure you there were 140,000 people in front of me on I-95 on our trip up here yesterday. More people than I'd go through Disney World on a good 3-day weekend, probably this weekend, than were the entire state. A lot of challenges. Was everybody in Florida a Confederate booster? No. There had always been folks who had opposed secession. And as the war went on, the cracks in Florida society around this question of unionism versus Confederatism would grow wider and wider. And one of the things I always tell my students is that Florida had a civil war. Civil war. Kind of like they have in Iraq, in Afghanistan. Not this conflict of knights and honor and the sort of thing you read about in romance novels. We had atrocities. We had hostages being taken, women and children being held hostage. It's a very mean time. Is Florida important to the Confederacy? Absolutely. Sends numerous supplies. Salt is its #1 item. Ironically, isn't sea salt back in fashion now? Well, during the Civil War, you could make a lot of money producing salt in Florida and sending it to Georgia and Alabama. Why is salt so important? You can't have a Confederate army without it. Preserved rations had to be salted. No food, no army. You also need salt to tan leather. And think about how many miles of leather were needed for uniforms and harnesses for horses and mules and the artillery. Very important. Florida cattle were huge. And the great irony of this, and I pointed this out and gotten mean looks from Texans, the Florida cattle industry was born in Florida, not Texas. And at least 75,000 head of Florida cows were delivered to the Confederate government, shipped to garrisons defending Charleston, to the Confederate Army in North Georgia, and some even to the starving federal prisoners in Andersonville. Florida would help to try to alleviate that tragedy. Now, while these efforts are going on, there are Union forces in the state. Key West remained under Union control. Pensacola soon would be under Union control. Fernandina, our own St. Augustine. In fact, St. Augustine became a Union rest and kind of relaxation center. And an area that needs more study, frankly, is the impact and the experience of Union soldiers in Florida during the Civil War. Now, those of you who are military veterans know that there are good duty stations and bad duty stations. Florida was a really good duty station during the Civil War. Sunshine, palm trees, low-intensity combat. We don't have any Gettysburgs here, or any Shilohs. It's one of the reasons why Florida doesn't get as much respect as it should from Civil War historians. We don't have these bloodbaths. Though I've always argued that if I were a Civil War soldier in any skirmish, engagement, or incident that I was in, if some fellows over there were trying to kill me, it's a major military engagement. It's not insignificant. They want to disrupt the supply line. And there would be raids and counter-raids. Never really able to successfully do it. And some Union commanders would write letters, they're still in the official records, saying, gosh, if we could disrupt this cattle trade, or if we could have more troops to shut down these salt works, we could really hurt the Confederate war economy. And the answer to that question is, yeah, they could have. But the Union government made a strategic decision not to put forces, significant forces, in an area they considered of secondary importance. Now, what about the folks who lived through this experience? All of them were impacted in some ways or another. And one of the things that I've been struck about is how many groups were involved in this that previously we didn't think. What about the Florida Seminoles? What was the role of the Florida Seminoles during the American Civil War? The ones in Florida, not the ones in Oklahoma. I've always imagined that the Seminole survivors of the Second and Third Seminole War in the Florida Everglades must have chuckled when they heard the white people were now killing each other in great numbers. And there was a real fear in the state, because no one knew how many Seminoles really were out there in those swamps. That with the disruptions of the war and so many adult men being gone, that they might take an opportunity for retribution and launch a fourth Seminole War. Far-fetched? Well, the state of Florida moved heaven and earth to make sure Florida Seminoles had trade goods that they wanted. Cloth, needles, even ammunition for hunting to keep them happy. And the Seminoles very wisely played one side off against the other. They would inform the Confederates of their contacts with Union troops in Florida. They came by and we chatted, but we really didn't interact with them. Sure. There was one group of Miccosukes who went to Fort Myers, which was a small Union outpost, about 1865, and chatted with Union soldiers there, and several of them were African Americans, members of the United States Colored Troops. And these Miccosukes were just stunned to see an African American in a blue Federal Army uniform carrying a weapon and being treated like a soldier. It must have been quite a moment. Florida Hispanics were impacted by this war. My research, I've discovered that at least 80, probably a lot more, Floridians of Hispanic descent served in the Confederate Army. In Virginia, in Tennessee. They served as supply officers. They served as foot soldiers. Some sickened and died. Some deserted. Some were killed in action as heroes. We need to know more about their story and how this plays out. Florida women were impacted by this war. With all these military-age men leaving, all of a sudden they find themselves running farms and running small businesses and finding out they could do things they never thought they could. Having to raise children on their own, educate children on their own, making do without essential supplies that the Union blockade had pretty much dried up. And this is an era, and I tell my students, where you couldn't call 911 if you were afraid at night, and it was dark at night when the sun went down. Think about how much effort we, as modern humans, put to light up the night with street lights and house lights. Imagine how dark it must have been on a frontier Florida farm at 8 o'clock at night when you're all alone, wondering. Combat in Florida. Was there? Absolutely. Florida's biggest battle was the Battle of Olustee in February of 1864. Very bloody, nasty affair. Ironically, a Confederate victory. The Lincoln administration would be chastised for yet another failure at Olustee. We're in the middle right now of the Civil War sesquicentennial, so I imagine that the reenacting of the Battle of Olustee, which will take place in February of 2014, will probably be quite a big affair. It usually is, if you've ever been, but this year they'll probably go all out. We're trying to make a big deal of the 150th anniversary of the war for those of us who won't be there for the bicentennial in 2061. I calculate I'll have to be 103, maybe. By 1865, the war, of course, is winding down. The state capital has not been captured yet. And much has always been made of the fact that Tallahassee was the only Confederate capital east of the Mississippi not to be captured by Union troops. True. The reason it wasn't captured is federal forces didn't want it. It had, frankly, very little military significance, politically significant, I suppose, but no military significance. Florida was a fully operational supply center, and in fact, was still shipping supplies north to a confederacy that no longer existed. And I'll conclude with two things. The first, after the lease run at Appomattox, the commanding general of all Confederate forces in Florida sent out a memo to the few troops that were here, explaining the significance of Appomattox. Not a big deal. We lost an army, so what? We lost more men at Vicksburg. The fight goes on, man. If we keep in the ranks and keep fighting, we'll force those Yankees into negotiating the sort of peace that we want. Now, I leave it to your imagination how the rank and file felt when they got that message. Most just went home. It's over. Well, okay, 1865, Confederacy collapses. What does this mean for Florida history? Well, Florida really didn't suffer that much damage during the war, really. I mean, Jacksonville was occupied on and off 4 times and will be, of course, rebuilt bigger and better than ever. Towns like Apalachicola never really recovered from wartime disruptions. Florida now has to deal with the absolute absence of slavery. The Civil War destroys the slave system permanently. How are we going to do that? How are we going to deal with, again, the Seminoles, who are still there? What are we going to do economically? How will our society function? What about these pesky Yankees who came down here as Union soldiers and want to come back? You know? And we have to have them here because they have money and skills that we need. How are we going to do that? Well, I think one of the biggest impacts of this conflict is it indeed brought so many people to Florida. Later, Professor Mormino will tell us about World War II, and he is the greatest expert on this there is. How these armed tourists would come to Florida and find out this is a pretty darn nice place. Imagine being a Union soldier from New York, Connecticut, Ohio, and coming to Florida in the middle of the winter. Sunshine, palm trees, the beach. When I did a search for a little pictorial history before I did with a colleague, I went to the National Archives to look for Florida pictures taken during the Civil War. And I found in their files dozens of pictures of palm trees. And I thought to myself, God, I can't put pictures of palm trees in this book because people will think I've lost what little sense I had when I started the project. And it finally dawned on me. The photographers took all these pictures of palm trees because they'd never seen one before. And these folks, of course, are going to come back to Florida. Union soldiers stationed in St. Augustine could go out and pick fresh citrus off a tree. We're spoiled. We can have fresh orange juice and fresh citrus every day if we want it. In fact, some of these fellows felt a little guilty about having fresh orange juice, and of course they sometimes added something else to their orange juice to help them get through the day. Why not send some citrus home to the folks back in New York? Well, how could they do that? Federal Express? No, the Adams Express Company. It existed. You could ship, if you could scrounge material for a box, citrus fruit from St. Augustine north. Sometimes it would get there without the whole box being spoiled. So this started that tradition of Floridians having to send fruit to various and sundry people that I'm sure practically everybody in this room has done at least once, and will do as we enter the holiday season this year. Now, Florida is going to be primed for its next big evolutionary growth spurt. And I think it's because of the interest that the war focused on the state. It's going to open up and prepare for a great, great wave of developers. The modern godfathers, plural, of Florida. And as promised, I'm going to be quiet and thank you.
I'm going to open the floor for questions so that we all can eat. So anyone interested in bringing up some of the points that officers raised so wonderfully, please go to the microphone.
Oh, I take the mic? All right. Mine's for Dr. Grant. Dr. Grant is so eloquently told the administration or the Democrat Party the Bourbon Democrats. Now, I know there has to be a reason for that, so I'd like you to explain it.
Yeah, it's really Bourbon, from the French ruling family that never learned anything and never forgot anything. The idea was these are the old timers. But in fact, they really weren't old timers. In some ways they were, but they were looking forward to a new Florida, a Florida that would have railroads and thriving businesses and a growing population.
The only old-time thing they wanted was to keep the old-time race relations the way they were, African Americans in their place. And in spite of the fact they were interested in, as Professor Graham said, new economic opportunities, but old race relations.
This is a good group to tell this to. I've been in politics and not helped and not hurt by what I do. But I go through a little town as I go to Sanibel Island and Captiva. I go to a little town called Nocatee. It's just south of Arcadia. And the Baileys have always been in the citrus business and always were buying their packing crates. And Dr. Graham, that's one of the things the lumber was used for, was packing crates for all the citrus that went north to New York so that you can get it there in a day's time. Well, I knocked on doors down there, found some history of Nocatee. The name came about, it looks like it's in Arcadia the way you just drive through. The name came about because the Indians were not aware of this big machine, the railroad, coming into town. And so when it did get there, and they had the dedication of the railroad, the Indians were all there asking, what Nocatee? Nocatee means, what is it? Get it? What is it? And that is the reason the expression came about. And so we ended up here with developers, as you mentioned, coming in, and they're still coming in. But I think that's an interesting story because what came out from those builders was that it meant something about beautiful land. And I can tell you after traveling over Florida on horseback that is one of the things about this area. It is the beautiful land. Thank you.
I think that's a great way to end this session, talking about old Florida, meeting new Florida. Some things change, some things don't, but it's still Florida, whatever that is. Thanks, we'll see you after lunch.